So today is week 3 in our series called I Literally Cannot. And really that's just a saying to talk about there are things that people cannot get over to believe in God or to put their faith in Jesus Christ. And so probably if you were to write that rest of that, I literally cannot, believe in God is basically what we're wrestling with. And so I'm very excited to get in this series. And like I've told you in the past couple weeks, this is probably more teaching than preaching. But just with the way that that's set up, I think it's important for us. And we're using this book by Pastor Mark Clark as kind of the framework for a lot of these questions that we're tackling, as kind of the framework for our series even. And so if you were with us, just a recap of where we've been so far. Week 1, we talked about the problem of science. Some people have thought you have to either believe in science or believe in God. You can't believe in both. But we landed on the bottom line that the facts of science are not at odds with the faith of religion, that those two things are compatible, and so we don't have to check our brain at the door when we walk into the church or something like that, but we can be people that think with rational thought and still believe in God. And then last week we talked about the hurdle of pain and suffering, and even talked really about the idea of what is the purpose of pain, and we came to the bottom line of suffering can either be a pointless hindrance to life or an opportunity for belief and hope in God. And we talked a lot about the fact that there's pain and suffering everywhere. And so whether you believe in God or not, it doesn't change that, but that it can either be a pointless hindrance to your happiness or it can be something that will give you hope in God. Now this week, we are actually going to be talking about a related problem to different people. And to hurdle, maybe we should have done this one first, because for some people that might have been the first part of the conversation, and that is the hurdle of God's existence. Because there's many people who just say, I don't even believe in a God. That would be most likely atheist. An agnostic would be someone that maybe says, I don't know if there's a God, or maybe I don't think there is, but I'm not 100% sure. So there might be people from both camps kind of in this thing, but there are people that say, I'm not even sure there's a God, I don't believe there's a God. And so I think really at the end of the day, the question of whether or not God even exists has a huge impact for our lives, including why we even gather in a place like this. Because if God doesn't exist, then why are we all here? That would be kind of silly, wouldn't it? And there are plenty of people that think it is silly. But anyway, so that's we're tackling that problem today. I think each of us, whether we're a believer or not, we need to base what we believe not simply on what we feel, but what is real, right? And so you and I have to decide for ourselves at some point in our lives. If the younger you are, then you kind of carry usually your parents' faith with you or your grandparents' faith, if you had that. But we can't live our whole lives on the beliefs of our parents and our grandparents. Many of us really are only 3 questions away from having our worldview crumbling if we're not sure of why we believe what we believe, especially as someone digs deeper into why do you believe it and how do you know. Sometimes it only takes 3 questions of why that will draw a person to say, I don't really know, and it can fall apart easily. And so I think as Christians, we need to make sure that we can answer those questions for ourselves. And I think anybody should be able to answer those questions. And so this is an opportunity to do some research and test out what we believe and use the mental capabilities that we have to follow the evidence. Now, we've discussed this every week, but everyone has a belief system, even if it's not a system of belief in faith. Christians have a belief system, atheists have a belief system, agnostics, apathetics have a belief system, which is just, I'm not even worried about it, but they view life through a certain lens. But our bottom line this week comes from the book from Pastor Mark Clark, and the idea of this week is this, is that we have to follow where the evidence leads, not where we hope it leads. And so that'll get us into the conversation today, because you and I are playing detective, and we'll move kind of fast. So I want to kind of remind you that you can revisit this message on YouTube or Facebook if you want to, but really we're playing detective in an attempt to look at the evidence as much as we can fit in before the noon kickoff of as much as we can fit in into the time together. But so we're playing that the detective to look at the evidence for the evidence of God. Now, evidence is one of the things that either confirms our suspicions or proves to us something that we've doubted. Now, Some of you might know this. I'm not sure how many of you know, but my wife, Dawn, one point in time, years ago, and she's not that old, so years ago for her would be like 7 years ago. 7 years ago, she ran a church daycare. She was the daycare director for a church. Now, it wasn't the church we were at. It was a church that was in the same town, and they had hired her to be the child care director. And so she loved that job. She loved kids. She still loves kids most of the time. And, no, she does. But she ran that child care. Well, the church decided that they were going to remodel part of the church and get new carpet throughout, including where the child care met. And so they had to shift different rooms and that kind of stuff. Well, when the people got in there to replace the carpet, what they realized pretty quick was that part of the floor needed replaced too, because the flooring was bad. So originally it was supposed to take 1 week. Now it was going to take an extra week because they had to replace this flooring. And so they replaced the flooring, and then so the 2 weeks started going a little longer, and they're like, man, it doesn't really seem like a lot of work's getting done, because the people were coming in, supposed to be working in those rooms throughout the week, and then when the child care was done, then they were supposed to come in after hours and work too. And so for a couple weeks, they were like, what's even happening? Because we're not seeing any progress in these rooms or anything like that. And so the pastor had a talk with the crew and said, hey, what's going on? This is taking a really long time, and you guys had promised us 2 weeks. We're already at 3 or 3.5. And they said, oh yeah, okay, well, we're really going to work really hard. We're going to come in this weekend, and we're going to just bust it all out. And they're like, okay, great. That sounds like a good plan. Perfect. And Dawn and a couple of her coworkers said, yeah, when we drove by the church, we saw their cars there. We can't wait to get in there on Monday and see how much work they've done. Well, they got in there on Monday, and nothing had been done. And they were like, what in the world really happened with that? And so what's interesting is that what the crew didn't know is a couple of months before that, the church had installed security cameras all throughout the church in each room. And so they went back and said, well, let's just see what they were up to. And so even though their cars were there, the evidence didn't point to much work. And what the footage showed, there was hours and hours of footage as you had people laying down on the ground, looking at their phone, sitting in chairs, looking at their phone, going to get Dairy Queen and coming back and eating ice cream, and sitting in these rooms that were supposed to be putting carpet down. And so they were fired. Because what there wasn't evidence of in all of that footage of film was that any work was being done. And so regardless of whether Don or the pastor wanted to believe these guys that were putting in carpet or give them the benefit of the doubt, the evidence showed that they had not been working, right? So you and I want to see in the same way what evidence we can find for God's existence. And so first, as believers, because of our worldview, it is somewhat natural and maybe even easy for us to say our evidence comes from the Bible. And so that's easy for us because we believe in the Bible. But is there more than Scripture that points to the existence of God? Is there evidence beyond Scripture, especially for someone who doesn't even know if they trust the Bible? Or, there's all kinds of theories about the Bible, and some of them are interesting. Some of them are laughable, but there's all these different theories about the Bible, and that's fine. But there are many avenues that we could go down, and we won't really be able to get to all of them today. But we're going to look at 2 or 3 things outside of Scripture that give evidence for God. The first evidence, or the argument for God, we will call the morality argument. This is the question, why are we moral creatures? Because morality, or this idea of right and wrong, doesn't necessarily fit into non-religious worldviews, especially evolutionary, naturalistic, or even relativistic worldviews that say we exist for no other reason than just to kind of propagate our species. Why would there be an idea of right and wrong if the whole reason we exist is just to have more people? Now, these other worldviews can't fully answer why we are moral creatures. If a lion kills a zebra, we don't call it murder and have a trial, do we? Maybe in a cartoon, but we don't call it murder in that situation. But if you were to kill me, we would. We understand right and wrong. C.S. Lewis, the author, said this: everyone has heard people quarreling, he says, and they say things like this: how'd you like it if anyone did the same to you? That's my seat. I was there. Leave him alone. He isn't doing anything against you. Why should you shove in first? Give me a bit of your orange. I gave you a bit of mine. Come on, you promised. Anybody ever heard that from their kid? Come on, you promised, right? That's the great injustice. People say things like this is him writing still. He says, people say things like that every day, educated people as well as uneducated people, and children as well as grown-ups. Now, what interests me about all these remarks is that the man who makes them is not merely saying that the other man's behavior does not happen to please him. He is appealing to some kind of standard of behavior which he expects the other man to know about. It looks, in fact, very much as if both parties had in mind some kind of law or rule of fair play or decent behavior or morality or whatever you like to call it about which they really agreed. Nobody has to teach kids to understand what's not fair. Nobody has to teach kids to say, that's mine, when someone else takes it. There are objective moral values that we all seem to not even have to discuss, but we understand. Spend 5 minutes with a group of 4-year-olds. Let's say there's 8 4-year-olds and you have 6 cupcakes. Right? What is that going to cause? Yeah. How long before you hear that's not fair? They got a cupcake and I didn't. Right? And tears and maybe even all kinds of other demonstrations of the injustice of it all, that everyone else got cupcakes except for these 2. Did anyone really have to teach them any of that? No. They're upset. You can say, well, that's because they're selfish. Well, yeah, I mean, I get that. But at the same time, it's the idea of like, hey, that's not fair. There's a sense of fairness in their mind. How does a 4-year-old give adults a lecture about the morality of them not getting a cupcake when the others did? It's because it was built into who they are. They seem to agree with what Paul wrote in Romans chapter 2 when he said, they demonstrated that God's law is written in their hearts for their own conscience, and thoughts either accuse them or tell them they are doing right. That's the reality of it, right? What's interesting is nobody has to tell you about what's right and wrong. We all kind of have that built into us, and we know some things are right and wrong just when they happen. And even if we can't always put a finger on it, we feel that within us at times, and it will well up when we see injustice. It's interesting, Charles Darwin said this: man scans with scrupulous care the character and pedigree of his horses, cattle, and dogs before he matches them. But when he comes to his own marriage, he rarely or never takes any such care. He says this: both sexes ought to refrain from marriage if they are in any way marked degree inferior in body or mind. He's saying don't marry people who aren't the best character and the best pedigree, who are without deformities or other issues that some would call inferior. How do you feel about that statement? Right? Like, that says that you shouldn't, basically, don't reproduce issues or defects. Do you see that this is where the idea of eugenics rose out of, and why things like the Holocaust, where 6 million Jews were killed because they were quote-unquote inferior? Why don't you believe this? Because we know what is wicked. We know what is evil. We know what is wrong, and we know what is right. We don't have to sit down and discuss. We instinctively know by our own moral values. If there is no moral force, why are we moral? Where do we get that from? Evolutionary and naturalistic worldviews also have difficult time explaining altruism and kindness. Like, why are people kind? Because most of those worldviews have the view that, hey, we're all animals and we only exist for our own survival. Like, you don't have to believe in God to be kind or to even be nice without the hope of something in return. But these things don't help you survive. What's the old saying? Nice guys finish where? Last. Right. So where does that fit into? It's survival of the fittest. And so instead what that kind of thing points to is that there's moral values even about what we get out of it. And for that to be the case, there has to be a standard that defines it for everyone. Now, another argument for God's existence is really the universe, the existence of creation. We spoke about this somewhat in week 1 with science, but we understand that physics and its laws do not answer every question of creation, especially when you get into the fields of like metaphysics, which is outside of what can be observed and tested. Metaphysics would be one thing, but it would be questions like, what happened when we die? What is the origin of life? How did it all begin? Those are metaphysical questions that physics can't really answer. Now, in the Gospel of John, he answered this question for some of the prevailing thinkers of his day, and we have that in John chapter 1 in the first 4 verses. He's speaking to kind of the leading scholars of thought at that time, and here's what we read in John chapter 1, beginning of verse 1. In the beginning, the Word already existed. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. He existed in the beginning with God. God created everything through him, and nothing was created except through him. The Word gave life to everything that was created, and his life brought light to everyone. That passage from John is really speaking to two groups. The first group it's speaking to are the Stoics. This was a philosophical group at that time that believed that behind the world that we see, there was a moral or a law-giving force. They just thought there was a force behind kind of the world that kind of ran everything. And so John is saying the word, or the logos is the Greek word, it showed up, and he's saying that word, that veiled behind the scenes, like moral force, showed up in person, and that force was Jesus Christ. And so the behind the scenes is being revealed. It's like the curtain is being pulled back on creation and on morality. Now, the other group in the prevailing thought, especially in the culture that John's speaking to, were the Jews themselves. They were kind of the religious, what were they? Kind of like the pinnacle of religious thought at that time in history. And they believed the world was created, as Genesis 1 talks about, in the beginning by God. And so John directly links Jesus to the beginning, saying he was there. He is one with God, and it was all from him. And so if he's the Word, if you think about that, in some way the Trinity, sometimes it's not easy to explain, especially with getting into heresy. But if you think of the idea that the Word, capital W, is really the living Word, which is Jesus. So if God spoke it, out of it comes the Word, then you can think of like Jesus interacting with the Holy Spirit. If you read Genesis 1, like if the Spirit is hovering over the water, you have the Trinity present at the beginning. And John is linking all these things for really what's going on there. And so he's saying it all came from God by way of Jesus Christ. And so other worldviews can't really answer who created the laws of physics or why there are laws of physics. It's almost a question they don't even try to answer. They're just telling you about the laws of physics, right? The universe is part of the argument, though, for the existence of God in this way, of like, where did that come from? Why do we have that? Why do they behave that way? And so there is also the idea then at the beginning of the universe, right? So we can say, okay, here's this universe, here's how it works, here's who designed it, but also like, how did it begin? That it began at a specific time. It doesn't always existed, but instead it began at a specific point in time. And this obviously correlates to the Jewish belief back in Genesis chapter 1 when it says, God spoke and it came into existence. Whatever exists has to have a beginning. Nothing plus something, or nothing plus nothing does not equal something. That's not how things happen. There's an award-winning scientist who mapped the human genome. His name is Francis Collins, and he gave his agreement to this. He said, the Big Bang cries out for a divine explanation. It forces the conclusion that nature had a defined beginning. I cannot see how nature could have created itself. Only a supernatural force that is outside of space and time could have done that. Now, the Big Bang Theory itself might not give God the credit, but it points to a birthday for the universe, that it didn't exist and then it did. Associate Professor of Physics at Auburn University, J.M. Wersinger, points out that the Big Bang seemed to give into the Judeo-Christian idea of a beginning of the world. According to the Big Bang Theory, all space, matter, energy, even time itself began to exist at a point in the past. That's what Pastor Mark Clark said. This is evidence that builds a case for the existence of God. Now, along those same lines, there's a final argument, and that is the argument for design. That everything was created with intentional purpose. That it wasn't just like, randomness. There used to be this joke, the idea that you couldn't stick 100 monkeys in a room with 100 typewriters, and they're going to out comes the Declaration of Independence. Nobody thinks that it just randomly happens like that, right? And so that would be intentional design. And so the evidence of intentional design, whether you believe in the Big Bang Theory or you believe that God said, let there be whatever, and a Big Bang happened, and everything was created, there is evidence of intended design, whether it's the fact that the human brain can hold the equivalent of 20 million books of design behind kind of the DNA, or that the probability of the universe forming on a chance of 10 to the power of 138, we find ourselves with the evidence that more and more indicate a designer, a design, a purpose. Stephen Hawking, who's, as far as I know, not agnostic, I think he's an atheist at least. He might be agnostic, or he was. He had this to say about the universe and the Big Bang. He said, if the rate of expansion 1 second after the Big Bang had been smaller by even 1 part in 100,000 million millionths, the universe would have recollapsed before it ever reached its present size into a hot fireball. The odds against a universe like ours emerging out of something like the Big Bang are enormous. I think there are religious implications. Interesting. Is it chance or is there design? The evidence, I think, points to a design. No one in here would pick up a book and say that book just spontaneously appeared. There's a cause and a purpose for a book. There's a creator for the book. There's a particular design for the book. There's a meaning of the book. We recognize that there was a designer that intended those things. There are multiple designers. Other worldviews often have to come up with answers for the universe, for the whys and the hows of not only our universe, but also our moral value comes to. One theory skeptics may believe is what Mark Clark calls the lucky us theory. This is the theory that, hey, we're just lucky. We're just the luckiest people that ever lived, and lucky us, it worked out, even though the odds were against us. Another theory skeptics believe, and it seems to show up a lot in comic book movies, is the idea of a multiverse. And that there's multiple parallel universes going on, and there's just as many universes created, and there are all these multiple universes, an infinite number actually, and so there are different versions of you in these different universes, right? Despite the lack of evidence for this, these are just theories. There's also theories with aliens coming and starting life and that kind of stuff. But I think that's why we can conclude, based on the information we have, based on what we see, that our bottom line is the idea is that we have to follow let me start again. We have to follow where the evidence leads, not where we hope it leads. And so if you remember back in week 1, we talked about there are some people that say, like, we can't even let the idea of religion into the door when we read this. And other people would say, well, I can't let the idea of anything. But really, if you pull that away, start looking at the facts, we believe there's an evidence of God's existence, both by our universe and our moral values. Our universe and the design behind it all point us to the conclusion. Now, you could look at all the facts, and you're still going to have to take a step of faith to believe. That's why it's called faith. The same is true, though, for other worldviews. It's not any different than atheism. You have to also take a step of belief that your theory or the different theories out there are going to lead to a disbelief. The alternative explanations offered have as much burden of proof for their theories as do the idea of God. If you are a Christian, I hope you understand more of the evidence of your beliefs. Grab a copy, I would say, if you're interested in this kind of study. There are multiple books out there. You could grab, there's a book called The Problem of God by Mark Clark. That's not a bad one. An older one that's also good is called The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. That's another book you can pick up and talk about some evidence of different things. And follow the evidence. Follow more than we can get just in a 30-minute talk or something. You know, one thing that people struggle with sometimes is say, well, science seems to indicate that the universe is a lot older than what the Bible would talk about. Have you ever heard that or ever thought that? Sometimes that's not easy to reconcile. Like, okay, some people say, well, the Bible talks about maybe the world's about 6,000 years old, or there's different theories. And then there's other people who say, well, it's millions and millions of years based on scientific evidence. So I want you to think about this, and maybe this will help you. And if it doesn't help you, then just don't even think of it. Just let it go. But, let's think of this. Like, the day that Adam and Eve were created, how old were they? Any ideas? What's that? Adults, right? We assume they're adults. So if they went, let's say there was a doctor somewhere, and they went and saw a doctor, and they said, they looked at them and let the science determine how old they were. Let's say they were 40 years old. Let's say God created them as 40-year-old adults, right? Because 40 is the new 30. No, but anyway, so he created these 40-year-old adults. Now, science would tell us, oh, these people are 40 years old. But how old were they? One day. They were hours old. And so I think that sometimes what that tells us is like the God that can create things can also create them at a certain point in time to where they're not going through the normal years of process. And so I'm not shook when somebody says, oh, well, science shows it's this old. It's like, it's not hard for me to believe. It's not a big stretch to say, okay, I can understand that science will tell us it's this old, but that doesn't mean that God created it at that age, right? Because I assume that he didn't create Adam and Eve as babies and wait for them to grow up and then they continue to record history. And so I believe that those kind of things aren't huge jumps in conclusions or logic for us to believe that. Because I think if you're already a Christian, like that idea isn't going to be a huge jump for you. If you're not, you might say, well, that sounds like you're just doing a lot of jumping through hoops to get there. But that's kind of our framework for belief, is that we have a God that can create things supernaturally. And so if you're a Christian, I hope that you know why you believe what you believe. And there's questions that you have. And if someone has a question, comes up to you with a question that you've never wrestled with, then take the time to say, you know what, I don't know. I haven't thought about that really. Let me go do some research. Let me talk to some people, and I'll get back to you with an answer. Don't run away from questions. Don't feel like you can't, investigate them. I mean, there are some questions we'll never be able to answer. That's just the reality. And so it's always going to take a step of faith to believe in that. If you aren't a Christian, I hope you had something to think about, something to wrestle with a little bit. And I challenge you too to pick up a book and test your beliefs and follow where the evidence leads you. And don't have to run away from it. But I believe that you'll find yourself in the same place as Paul and John, who find God revealed in the evidence as well as in the Bible and through his son Jesus Christ. Because we hold that the biggest revelation of God was in the person of Jesus Christ. I think that's why the book Case for Christ is cool, because it talks about, can you prove the existence of Christ and what he said? And it's really an opportunity just to engage your minds. I think for too long, the church has been seen as a place where you have to just stuff all thinking and reason somewhere else, and you come in here and just turn your brain off. And we don't want to be people that just turn our brains off. God has asked us to follow him and love him with our minds, our bodies, and our souls, not just everything else. And so next week we'll be continuing this series, and so I invite you back for that. Will you stand with me as we pray?